Hey guys, so of course we just had YCS Dortmund conclude, so as usual I wanted to provide a tier list using data from Dueling Book through YGScope, as well as topping information through the YCS as well as regional events post ban list, and you can certainly check out my older videos in terms of learning how the tier scores are actually calculated. And of course, before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always. Definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as sleeves and supplies. So let's just get to the tier list for this month, and we are going to start with Unchained still. I get it, it did not have the most representation at YCS Dortmund, but nonetheless, you know, if you include just like YCS Dortmund as well as regional level events and even online play, Unchained still like the most played deck and certainly the most popular. It's still a very, very strong deck. Just being able to, you know, go through a lot of interruptions and just being able to set up, you know, let's say like Caesar for the monster negates, they have a lot of pops and they just have a really, really strong grind game and doesn't necessarily die to Shifter, which is kind of key now that we're going to see a rise in Tearlaments again. And speaking of Tearlaments, we do have this deck now at second on this tier list, and it's a deck that I think a lot of people sort of suspected would come back into the meta ever since that, you know, for example, Kashtira sort of, you know, presumably dying off after the recent ban list, and so we are seeing a lot of this deck in terms of, you know, online as well as IRL play now. It's really strong because, you know, it can set up, let's say, I don't know, like Rocalis for the monster negate. It can even set up like Winda or that Grapha extra deck monster, which almost for the most part serves as an omni negate. It has, you know, like back row interruptions, so a lot of layered interruptions through like, you know, monster negate or even a counter trap at that, and so it's pretty strong, especially when something like let's say Unchained, they just do a lot of popping, and if you were to like pop any Tearlament monsters, like they're just gonna start fusing and just keep coming back anyway. So it's got a pretty good place in this current format. Of course, one of the downsides I don't like about when Tearlaments is meta, as we saw, like, you know, from like the last beginning of the year to end of last year, is that, you know, you have all of a sudden a lot of decks that will start playing a lot of Bestials again, as well as and or decks that can play Shifter as well, and so it just makes it hard for a lot of other decks, particularly rogue decks, to kind of stick around. Next we have Purrely. I understand that, you know, in terms of conversion, perhaps was a little disappointing at YCS Dortmund, but you know what, it still did get YCS level tops as well as regional level tops. It's still hanging in there. It's still a good deck. You know, X Purrely Noir is really hard to out for a lot of decks still, and they have a lot of space for non-engine as well, and just being able to play a lot of different hand traps. They can also draw a lot, and so just being able to not only have like whatever interruptions you set up, which I guess from a board presence maybe not too much, but just being able to back that up with a lot of hand traps, and also just having a really insane grind game. Next, we actually have Dragonrider still at tier 1 level, despite those little hits on that recent ban list with the Chaos Space as well as the Magma Nut. Sure, they do hurt, but it's certainly not game ending as it was, let's say, you know, it's not like they got Striker Dragon banned or anything. So it's still very strong. It still did well at, you know, YCS level events as well as the regional level events. I think it's going to hang in there, especially now that we are seeing a rise in Tearlaments again. And, you know, Dragonrider just happens to be a deck that plays, or rather can play, a lot of Bestials. It's just essentially part of their engine, and it's, you know, the Bestials are good against both Unchained as well as Tearlaments, so it's got a good place in this format as well. Moving on to tier 2, we do have Branded Chimera, which I think is a fair spot. I think, you know, at one point maybe they were like tier 1 when they first kind of came into the mix, but I think now it's kind of clear that it's more of a tier 2 level deck. Like, it's strong in the sense that, you know, if it gets to go first, if it gets to resolve Mirror Sword Knight, you know, you're going to be able to rip a card out of the opponent's hand, and also have a pretty good amount of hand traps in this deck as well, on top of, you know, Chimera Fusion, which leads to like Guardian Chimera pop. They can also have access to something like Rinbrum, which serves as like a, not only a bounce, but at a later point in the game can also serve as like a way to summon Albaz and go into Mirror Jade as well. So it's got layered interruptions like Branded Despia. Of course, it had a few tops at the YCS Dortmund, although surprisingly Branded Despia actually had a little bit more tops, I think, from at least what was publicly available. So I think it's still quite a strong deck, but certainly not at the tier 1 level as the decks that we see at the top here. We also have Flunder, of course, while not part of the data for this video because that was prior to this recent ban list, but it did win YCS Cancun, and, you know, it is a Shifter deck, so as we kind of saw in that tier 0 format, you know, Flunder was one of the decks that were hanging around because it could play Shifter. They were also playing something like Necro Valley to be able to combat something like Tearlaments, and also Flunder happens to have a good matchup against Unchained as well, so I think it's in another good spot as long as Unchained and, like, let's say they're tier 1, but again, you know, Tearlament versus Flunder, it's not necessarily like totally one-sided or anything. It really comes down to like Shifter. We also have branded Despia, similar to the likes of Chimera, which I also should have mentioned. I think while Ash is seeing a lot of play, you'll also notice when I do these like top cut breakdowns of the most played hand traps, I think a lot of people are actually starting to side deck Ash as well, instead of like just main decking it as it historically has been, which is really good because game one, whether it's branded Chimera or branded Despia, if they get to go first, it's going to be pretty strong for them because, you know, Chimera will, again, like rip a card, whatever, but Despia can also serve that gimmick puppet lock, so as long as you're not playing against something like Thunder, which does not special summon at all, branded Despia is going to have a really good time if it gets to go first, and just assuming that they don't brick, which sometimes they can, definitely as a branded Despia player, I know that feeling, but it actually did quite out well at YCS Dortmund. We also have Labrynth, which kind of got written off a little bit in the last month or so. I mean, it's certainly still hanging in there. I mean, you know what? If it can like turbo out D-Barrier, I'm sure it's a pretty good time, especially when Tearlaments are coming back into the mix as well. So I think it's a deck that you just cannot sleep on just yet. We also have Vanadium, so this, especially with, you know, Droll coming down in play in terms of like main deck, and quite frankly even in the side deck, I was a little bit scared of decks like this and like, let's say, Dark World, because if decks like these, you know, if they get to go first like Vanadium, and you don't have Droll, it's gonna be really hard to go through their board. Not only do they have multiple interruptions through monsters, but they even have like a counter trap, which is really insanely strong. So it's incredibly hard to play through this if you don't have Droll. But if you do have Droll and they don't have something like Cross Out, then you're probably winning that game as well. So definitely something that I think we have to be on the lookout for, with, you know, Droll continuing to see decline in play. And then we have Spright. So this actually sort of saw a little bit of a resurgence as well. This post-ban list, it actually got a few YCS level tops. I think, you know, a lot of them are like, you know, the Spright Melfi, like they're trying to go first, but then you also have like the Ding Can Fan version where it's like trying to go second and just like OTKing. I think Spright is in an interesting situation because, again, it's a deck that's, it can kind of play shifter. It's something that we did during that tier 0 format. I played Spright during that format as well, and it's something that we saw, you know, at least when we're going second, because we don't necessarily die to it. We don't really play optimally under shifter, but Spright can still do a lot of plays under it. So, you know, in a format where like Tearlaments possibly coming back into the mix, and, you know, Spright I think is actually pretty solid. It has a lot of engine, or rather a lot of space for non-engine as well, so can certainly be flexible going first or second. Moving on to the Rogue tier, we unfortunately have Rescue Ace that got tier just at this point. I think it's technically still a tier 2 deck. You know, YCS level wise, it hasn't had that many tops though, I think, as maybe people might have expected. I believe it's actually going to get better though, this deck, post Age of Overlord as well, so that's certainly something exciting to look forward to, which is just in actually a few weeks, and I'm sure this tier list will change quite a bit once that set's actually legal. But you know what, being able to set 4 is pretty nice. Of course, it's a little bit predictable because your opponent's going to be able to actually see which 4 cards you're setting, just they don't know where you're setting it, but for the most part, you know, like a pop, a negate, and whatever, it can be pretty good as well. We also have Vanquish Soul, which actually did really well at YCS Dortmund, and it's another deck that I was actually just saying to my friends how I think it's in a pretty good spot as well, because it's a deck that can also play shifter, which means it doesn't die to something like, let's say, like Thunder, especially with the rise of like Tearlaments, which means increase in decks that play shifter, and also can main deck There Can Be Only One, which is really good against certain strategies like, let's say, Unchained, as well as Dragon Link, and also even Thunder as well. So I think it's pretty solid. And the good thing with Vanquish Soul too is that, you know, people aren't really playing like Regeki or Dark Hole on the side anymore, especially with Kashtira being gone. And then, you know, Regeki Dark Hole is not going to be very good against something like Tearlaments or Unchained, where you're just going to trigger everything. So I think in that case, Vanquish Soul can actually have a bit of a leverage there in that regard. And also, it actually is getting support in Age of Overlord as well, so just a lot more to look forward to. The only downside of Vanquish Soul is that it is quite a costly deck, considering that it's not a tier 1 deck. We also have Salamangreat, which of course it did get some recent support in Soul Burning Volcano not that long ago. It also got Gazelle back to 3 just in this recent list. I think it had some regional level tops, which is good to see. I believe though, from a YCS level event perspective, even since its new support in Soul Burning Volcano, I don't think it's gotten any YCS level tops. Hopefully that changes in the future. I think Salamangreat also has at least something to play with in terms of, you know, just being able to make rank 4 plays like Abyss Dweller, which is going to be very good against something like Unchained. And again, the rise in Tearlaments, which is sort of how they had to play during that tier 0 format for like the 3 Salamangreat players out there during that time. You also have Rika, which of course won YCS Dortmund. Unfortunately, it's tiered this low just because it doesn't see that much play, especially online on Dueling Book, I find, which is, you know, of course, a big component of the data for these tier lists, score calculations. But Rika Son of Avalanche, just really strong deck. The last month or so, it saw a huge decline in play. I think like starting post Duelist Nexus, because I think presumably at the beginning of that format especially, you know, a lot of people were playing main decking Droll even because they were scared of like Vanadium possibly being like one of the best decks, and it ended up not being the case, and then Droll came out. Of course Nibiru is still seeing play, or maybe that's also changed too, we'll see. I'm going to do a top cut breakdown of the most played hand traps after this YCS tournament very soon, and you know, of course Nibiru is seeing play because of Unchained. Of course Nibiru is not really great against Tearlaments, so maybe that also sees a decline as well, and in that case just all the better for Rika players. We also have Hero. So this actually I just recently saw finish second place at LA Regionals, which is like 800 players, which is like a very, very large regional. And I believe it was actually Nathan Christmas, who was the same one who topped the NAWCQ, if you remember, in July with Hero. Quite frankly, I think the sweetest man I've ever met in my life. So, you know, huge props to him. I think from what I heard, though, from my friend Drew at least, I don't think Hero's actually in that good of a spot anymore from a rogue perspective, just because, you know, a lot of Hero's interruptions is like pops, and of course again something like Unchained, or now even the case of Tearlaments, that's not going to be that good. Dark Angel presumably is probably not that amazing against something like Unchained. Purrely can just get rid of it with going to it with Anima. And then also, you know, like as I mentioned earlier, when you see a rise in play of Tearlaments, then you're going to see a rise in play of Bestials because they were already good against Unchained anyways. And on top of that, you're going to also see a rise in decks that play Shifter, and Shifter just also completely shuts down Heroes, unfortunately. Next we have Kashtira, how the mighty has fallen. So I think this is actually kind of more so related to maybe, you know, kind of like after the initial, like banless initial reaction where people just decide to, you know what, let's just move beyond it and just go with the next best toy. But at the same time, I think Kashtira is actually still quite solid. A lot of things I've seen is just more so going second builds now and just breaking boards, and Kashtira Unicorn is still quite strong. I even saw like Kashtira Tearlaments, I think, top the regional, but I think that deck was more Tearlaments than Kashtira. But nonetheless, I think this deck is actually still pretty solid, and certainly no worse than Rogue. Next we have Infernoble, which I don't believe had any regional top 8s so far with this new ban list. Of course, there's only been one weekend with this new ban list, and of course maybe there actually was a regional top 8 somewhere, it's just that it was not really documented, at least in the resources that I could find. So Infernoble, again, still a really strong deck, especially when it gets to go first. Dark Ruler is not seeing that much of a play right now, which is good for Infernoble, and even if there was play of Dark Ruler, you know, post Age of Overload they get Angel Ring, which helps them play around Dark Ruler a lot better. So I think Infernoble is still a deck that you have to respect, especially when they're going first. They can set up, you know, multiple spell trap negates. They have like a monster negate and gear feed, and even something like you can also shift gears and go into like Barone, and you know, the Charles can also provide a pop as well. We also have Dark World, as I kind of mentioned about Vanadium. You know, if you see a decline in Droll, you're going to see an increase in decks like Dark World, which can just go off if they get to go first, and especially uninterrupted. They're probably going to get to a point where you just make you like kind of get rid of your almost like your entire hand, and they can just kill you. Or I think some can even like do like burn damage and FTK you. So nonetheless, quite frankly, this is definitely not a fun deck to play against. I don't think even Dark World players would disagree with that, but it can really be really strong, especially in a format where Droll is just not seeing that much play anymore. And lastly, into the final tier, we have Mathmech, which unfortunately did not have any regional tops so far as well. Again, it's only been one weekend with this new ban list. You know, online, it always does really well, 59% win percentage. But as I mentioned about, you know, when I was talking about, like, let's say Heroes, just when you have an increase in play of, you know, like Bestials as well as Shifter, presumably in this new format now, like, it's going to be a pretty hard time for Mathmech, unfortunately, just as how we saw it completely drop in play when Tier 0 format kind of first started. And lastly, we also have Drytron, which actually got a regional top, and that's why I wanted to include it here. Unfortunately, not seeing that much play online or anything. Not doing too well online either, but you know what? I still like a pretty fan favorite rogue deck, ritual-based strategy. The only downside, again, similar to the likes of Mathmech and Hero, Bestials plus Shifter, really bad for Drytron, but if it does get to go first, it can set up something like, let's say, like even Vanity's Ruler. I mean, there's like other variants too, like there's also like that turn skip version, or maybe they actually do both turn skip and the Vanity's Ruler, I don't know, but nonetheless, those options are still there and can be pretty respectable when it gets to go first. There's also some other decks that I didn't get to include in this video just because YCS Scope just cannot identify these at all, and that is Mikanko, which actually topped YCS Dortmund as well, and definitely regional level events leading up to this event, so definitely something that you have to be mindful of. It's like a going second deck and just essentially just tries to attack into you and just deal damage to you instead of themselves. Really kind of interesting gimmick. And Phantom Knight, I was surprised. It actually had like 3 regional tops so far, I think, in this new format even. I'm not sure what's changed with Phantom Knight. Of course, it hasn't been meta relevant ever since, let's say, like Verde Anaconda kind of got the axe. So really interesting to see and whether this trend will continue. Alright, so that was it for the meta tier list for this month. Hopefully you found that interesting. And certainly let me know how you think the tier score ended up for this month. And I'm really excited to do this post Age of Overlord as well, which will come out kind of like at the end of the month as well. So anyways, a big thanks to all of you for watching. Huge thanks to my patrons as always for the continued support. And well, take care, guys.